Greetings, friends of liberty. Those of you acquainted with our recent past, from where I stand here in the late 18th century, will know of our glorious revolution of 1688, a revolution singular, both in its effectiveness and its peacefulness, all in sharp contrast, of course, to the present disturbances among the garlic eaters across the way. In truth, one could hardly contrast the differences between our two nations more starkly than in comparing how we accomplished our most famous revolutions. Tranquil success in the succession on this sceptred isle, this other Eden, on the one hand, and bloody tyranny in the land of cheese, le pays de fromage. Of course, one of the fundamental rights subsequently enshrined in English law by that revolution was the right and even duty to keep and bear arms, to defend one's own life and property, to contribute to the general order and peacefulness of the realm, in raising a hue and cry to apprehend criminals and preserve the king's peace, and to enable the resistance and, if necessary, revolt of the nation against tyrants, as that typical Papist James II was becoming. However, if we turn to the England and Wales of the 21st century, we find a very different state of affairs regarding gun rights. In Guns and Violence, the English Experience, Joyce Lee Malcolm, one of the foremost Anglo-American scholars of the right to keep and bear arms, describes in detail for the last 4 centuries both the history and nature of this right in England and Wales and its role in achieving the king's peace. She begins her scholarship by noting the modern ubiquity of the belief that more guns means more crime. As she says, conventional wisdom equates the number of guns in private hands with the frequency of armed crimes. Does this, the history of England and Wales, prove? To answer, she begins by returning us to medieval England, before there were many firearms available to the citizenry, and asks, what were the crime rates then? And the answer is that rates of some crimes, like homicide, were approximately 18 to 23 per 100,000 in the 13th and first half of the 14th centuries, which works out to about 10 to 20 times that of today. Incidentally, it should be noted, partly because there were so few societal resources available to maintain long-term prisons, and partly because homicide and crime rates were so high, capital punishment was used for a wide variety of offenses. England simply didn't have the resources to keep everyone in a modern penitentiary. At that time, some of the justifiable uses of force or deadly force were A, in self-defense, it being generally allowed, although if an altercation had started in hot blood, one was obliged to retreat as long as possible before killing. B, in killing anyone who himself was committing a felony. And C, in helping quell riots or to respond to a hue and cry by helping to pursue and catch criminals. Incidentally, Malcolm relates that what sometimes happened in jury trials throughout these centuries was that juries would actually alter the true facts of a case so that the outcome would meet their understanding of justice. As she says, as a result, 2/3 to 3/4 of those accused of theft were eventually acquitted and not hung as the law would have required. Later, at the end of the 18th century, perhaps the most common form of death overall was of infants by infanticide. And juries in these cases as well were hesitant to apply the death penalty to mothers, perhaps not because of pity for the women involved, but from dislike of the statute's presumption of guilt, which was felt to be un-English. Additionally, even regarding the prior charging of criminals per se, by 1819, members of London's middle class frankly admitted that they were unwilling to bring charges against shoplifters and pilfering servants, lest those accused be hanged as a result. But back to our narrative. In the 1500s, firearms, muskets, birding guns, and pistols began to come into common use when homicides were already on the decline. And we find then that contrary to the expectation that crime would increase, it continued to decrease. As she says, regarding murder, for the 16th century, the rate for Nottinghamshire was less than 14.8 per 100,000, while the Middlesex rate was approximately 6.3. Incidentally, despite laws by sovereigns mandating the use of the longbow, the use of these bows died out as citizens over time saw the greater value of firearms. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the right of self-defense by firearms was explicitly justified by the Convention Parliament of 1689. And what happened subsequently? As she says, the homicide rate between 1660 and 1800 dropped by 2/3. But in June of 1780, with the Gordon riots, events tested our English love of gun rights. Here, General Gordon led a large crowd of Protestant protesters who were angered at recent legislation granting more tolerance to Catholics into London. The crowd quickly degenerated into a mob, causing widespread destruction and attacking and burning numerous embassies, Catholic chapels, and the Bank of England. The army, eventually called in, killed 300 to 700 people in quelling the disturbance. But did the riot and its aftermath change attitudes concerning the right to bear arms at all? No. As the Recorder of London subsequently said, the right of His Majesty's Protestant subjects to have arms for their own defense and to use them for lawful purposes is most clear and undeniable. It seems indeed to be considered by the ancient laws of this kingdom not only as a right, but as a duty. This societal stress test having been successfully passed, rates of homicide continued to decline. As she says, Surrey went from some 6.2 homicides per 100,000 in 1660 to 1679 to 0.9 in 1780-1802. The Sussex rate declined from 2.6 to 0.6. And later in the 19th century, to the First World War, reported assaults fell by 71%, woundings by 20%, and homicides by 42%. And how frequent were gun crimes? They were rare. Between 1878 and 1886, the average number of burglaries in London in which firearms were used was 2 per year. And given the huge decrease in violence of all kinds, punishments became much milder. As she says, by 1841, the more than 200 capital crimes in the books when the century began had been reduced to 11. Ironically, however, just as the ability of widespread weapons ownership to reduce crime and keep the peace was being demonstrated in decade after decade of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with unparalleled reductions in crime, politicians and especially bureaucrats increasingly opposed this weapons freedom. Some of the unfortunate milestones of this regression that ended in the Firearms Act of 1968 were the following. In 1870, the government passed a Gun Licensing Act, initially proposing to charge £1 a year to own a gun, a significant burden on the lower classes, thereby surreptitiously trying to reduce gun ownership. The fee, however, was eventually reduced to 10 shillings. As the Chancellor ultimately admitted, I think it is a good object to discourage the lower classes from habitually carrying deadly weapons. I wish to keep the poor out of crime, thereby ignoring that A, guns were hardly ever being used in the commission of crimes, and B, were effectively being used by poor law-abiding citizens to protect themselves from criminals. And as all this occurred when, as she says, in the course of 3 years, according to hospital reports, there were only 59 fatalities from handguns in a population of nearly 30 million people. Of these, 19 were accidents, 35 were suicides, and only 3 were homicides, an average of 1 a year. By handguns from 1890 to 1892. That is a civilized society. That is what my England was. In 1887, the Conservative government tried but failed to pass a law punishing criminal use of firearms with life in prison. In 1889, the Foreign Office actually investigated foreign countries to see how they accomplished gun control among their citizens. Generally, they found that monarchies controlled their citizens' guns and gun use more than republics did. The 1903 Pistols Act was a first, albeit relatively mild step in increasing control over firearms. It required a 10-shilling fee and, B, restricted purchase of a pistol, to persons over 18 and not drunken or insane. The Firearms Bill of 1920 was the next step down. The government, fearful of anarchy with the example of the Russian Revolution and threatened labor strikes in the air, was egged on by its own hysteria and A, required of gun purchasers that they get a certificate from their local chief of police, who had the subjective and arbitrary power to decide their fitness to own a weapon. B, required that purchasers prove to the police chief they had a good reason for requiring a gun. C, regulated how much ammunition they could buy. And D, made them redo the whole process every 3 years. Of course, when World War II rolled around, the government in 1939, via the Home Office, rapidly reversed its stance. As she says, every Briton between 17 and 65 years of age who had ever handled a weapon and did not suffer from any physical disabilities was eligible to serve as a local defense volunteer in a home defense force. It was a return to the 17th century militia. And we might ask, incidentally, with all those soldiers and volunteers during World War II having access to weapons, did crime rates increase in line with the increasing governmental trust of its citizenry? No. In the London area, there was less crime in 1940 than in 1939, and less in 1941 than 1940. Thefts of cars fell almost to nothing. Bicycle thefts fell, and possibly as a consequence of the blackout, burglary during the evening declined dramatically. After the war, however, the government continued and intensified its illogical and rights-violating pre-war stance, with the Home Secretary saying in 1946, "I would not regard the plea that a revolver is wanted for the protection of an applicant's person or property as necessarily justifying the issue of a firearms certificate." It turned out that normal justices and 75% of applicants for firearms were unaware that the Home Office was instructing the police to deny certificates for weapons intended to protect home and property. As Malcolm says, ministers never explained why this dramatic reversal of centuries of common law was preferable to imposing a greater penalty on criminals who used weapons. Now let's proceed to the final period under review from 1953 to the year 2000. She titles it, "Only the Criminals Have the Guns," and indeed this encapsulates the disturbing reality. What were the damaging results for the civilian population? The murder rate by 1961 was up by 94% from the beginning of the century. Felonious woundings up 450% by 1963. Malicious woundings up 1,779%. Robbery rose 1,013%. Armed robberies in London rose from 4 in 1954, when there were no controls on shotguns, and double the number of licensed pistol owners, to 1,600 in 1991. In 1998, a year after a ban on virtually all handguns, gun crime was up another 10%. Of course, other factors have contributed as well to the enormous increase of crime, among these being treating juvenile offenders leniently and reducing prison sentences and police personnel, both with the aim of cutting costs. An examination of individual cases are shocking in the callous disregard by modern British law of victims attempting to defend their lives and property. For example, in March 1987, two men assaulted Eric Butler in a London subway car, strangling him and smashing his head against the door. No one in the car came to his aid. Later, Butler testified, "My air supply was being cut off, my eyes became blurred, and I feared for my life." In desperation, he unsheathed a sword blade in his walking stick and slashed as one of them as my last means of defense, stabbing the man in the stomach. The assailants were charged with unlawful wounding, but Butler was also tried and convicted of carrying an offensive weapon. This is a stark reversal of the norms of civilization itself, exemplified in the pathetic English jurisprudence of today. We see how far my country has regressed from what it was. In another case, an elderly pensioner succeeded in frightening off a gang of thugs by firing a blank from a toy gun, only to be arrested for the crime of putting someone in fear with an imitation firearm. One is left speechless at English law. The courts here actually in reality functioning institutionally to protect criminals. In line with this reversal of justice, fewer criminals have been incarcerated than before the war, and those who have been imprisoned were given shorter sentences and seldom served more than a fraction of those. And so the ironic result is that the penalty for possession of a firearm or imitation firearm during the commission of a crime was 7 years, a harsher penalty than for rape or for most other violent crimes, just for the possession of a firearm. Notable also, of course, is the rise in juvenile crime, with 2/3 of violent sexual attacks, assaults on police, and attacks in public places committed by offenders under 25. And this occurs simply because juveniles are punished for their crimes. The police, too, as anyone who reads the newspaper knows, do relatively little nowadays to fight crime, as exemplified by the fact that there was, for robbery, by 1995, less than a 1% chance of conviction. So 99% of robbers are either never caught or go free. So given all this, it was not surprising that the Firearms Act of 1997 levied even more draconian penalties for possession of a firearm, increasing the punishment to 10 years in jail. Let me leave you with some stats comparing crime in 1901, when firearms were freely available to Englishmen, to the year 2001, a century later, when very few citizens were legally allowed guns. These stats are easily downloadable online from the UK governmental site. Now, I should preface this by saying that I'm not implying, of course, that all of the increase in English crime is due to the greatly increased violation of the right to keep and bear arms, but that part of it is. So what do these stats show for various crimes? A, homicides for England and Wales, with about 32 million people in 1901, were 351, and in 2001, 891, which, adjusted for the population increase of 62% to 52 million during that century, would have been 550. So homicides increased from 351 to a population adjusted 550. B, rapes went from 236 in 1901 to 9,734 in 2001, or a population adjusted 6,009. So from 236 to 6,009. This figure, though, is harder to interpret than the others because, A, likely many females didn't report rape in 1901, and B, definitions of it have changed, with rape now commonly including any type of penetration, whether digital or otherwise. C, robbery went from 234 in 1901 to 121,359 in 2001, or a population adjusted 74,913. So from 234 to almost 75,000, a rate of increase over 300 times, after the citizens themselves were robbed by their state of their ability to defend themselves with firearms. D. Burglary. It went from 8,452 in 1901 to 878,509, or population adjusted 542,290. That is an increase of over 64 times. E. Finally, if we examine theft and the handling of stolen goods, we find in 1901, 64,949, and in 2001, 1,399,390, or a population adjusted 863,820. That's an increase of about 13 times. So 2 comments on these stats. First, while you'll often find liberals claiming or implying that the high level of gun control in the UK is the cause of the very low homicide rate, you'll rarely hear them say that homicide rates increased significantly from 351 to 550 after gun control was imposed. Second, you'll rarely hear liberals admit the enormous increase in the rates of rape and property crime after the imposition of gun control. So in conclusion, this book rates an A minus for being highly readable, well argued, getting its history perfect, and just the right length at 255 pages. Would this letter opener suffice to protect me in your modern England if a burglar were to break into my residence?